we ask that you do your best, engage as much as you can, try not to multitask, but we also know if you have to, you know, get some water or just take a break, we totally understand that. And to that end, we will take a 2-minute break after about halfway through the session this morning, so that everyone can kind of stretch their legs and just take a breather. So I want to just go ahead and keep us moving, and hopefully, Carol, just ping me when you're ready to make, oh, there it is, cool. So let me go ahead and share my screen so that we have our slides today. Okay, can everyone see the slides? I am hoping yes. Okay. Let me bring up the chat box so I can see all of you. Great. All right, so this is what I was just talking about, is just, we understand, do your best, be here as much as you can. I'm just going to take a couple minutes to tell you briefly a little bit about ACS, Advocacy and Communication Solutions. So we've been around since 2004, and our core client base is nonprofits, government, and philanthropic organizations. And so we've worked on a lot of different issues. As you can tell by our name, advocacy is one of our key strengths. We do lobbying at the state and federal level, and a lot of work supporting partners and learning how to use advocacy as an effective strategy. We also are communications experts, so that ranges from message development to media relations to strategic communication planning. And as you'll see today, of course, we're talking a lot about messaging, and so you'll see a lot of that is something that we're really passionate about and that we take a lot of pride in. We also do strategy development. So we've worked actually across the state of Louisiana, helping the early childhood Ready Start networks with their strategic planning and capacity building, and are really passionate about that work. And then again, capacity building. So facilitation training, advocacy, lobbying training, communication training. So some of what you'll be hearing about today is things that we do with our clients on a tailored one-on-one basis to meet their needs. I'm just going to take a quick second to make sure that everybody is muted, so bear with me. Okay, don't want any background noise. I know we've got a lot of people this morning, so thank you. So ACS works in 5 different issue areas. Obviously, early childhood is the one that is most topical for us this morning. Let me go back one. We also work on K through 12 issues, and throughout the last couple of years, we've worked very closely with the Louisiana Department of Education, as I mentioned, supporting the Ready Start networks and with other messaging work. And we have a long history in this state, and are just really excited to be able to be here talking with you all this morning. I'm going to just skip ahead. You can see we've got a national presence, and obviously Louisiana's on there. And then again, we're all this morning based in Ohio. So I want to keep us moving because I know we're a little bit behind schedule. So we just wanted to do a quick icebreaker this morning to get everyone kicked off. So we've got a silly little poll that I'm going to launch, and hopefully this is going to show up on your screens right now, which is, what's the strangest thing you've ever done while you've been attending an online meeting, which I think we're all have all experienced in these last couple of months of lockdowns. I'm just going to give folks a couple seconds to answer. Oh, somebody wrote, this is my first one. Wow. Well, welcome. All right. Got a couple more. I'm going to give it 5 more seconds. Okay, so I'm going to end the poll and share out the results so you can all see them. Okay, so it looks like we've got a tie between eating a meal and working in pajamas. Both very understandable. I'm impressed by the people who are watching TV at the same time. That is some multitasking skill. All right. Well, thank you for that. That was just a fun little way to kick off our morning. So before we dive into the rest of the content this morning, which again focuses on messaging and how to remove jargon, we're really going to be talking about some strategies and tools that you all can use to effectively communicate the value of early childhood to others. So we're not going to be focusing too much on how you work individually with children or message to children, but definitely to families and other members of your community. that need to understand how important this work is. We're also going to specifically talk about how to remove jargon words from your messaging and give you some concrete examples. And we're also going to spend some time on how to improve your presentations, because we know that in a lot of situations, you are being asked to go out and communicate about your work and about education to audiences, and you may be doing that through the form of a PowerPoint or a presentation. So we just want to give you a few quick tips on how to do that work. And again, we had asked in the chat for you to tell us some more ways, and I'm seeing a lot of just people interested in communication strategies and tactics to just do your work a little bit more effectively and communicate with audiences that might not be as up to speed on the concepts and the words in the education space. So we'll be doing that. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Scarlett, who is going to talk a little bit about the definitions of communication.
Awesome. Thanks, Lauren. And I think you're going to be advancing the slides if I'm not mistaken. So I'll continue to prod you throughout. So we're just going to build some baseline terms here, because we hear all these types of terms all the time. And what ACS has been obsessed about over the years is making sure that we help frame up the science behind the way we speak to one another in whatever format that might be. So what is communication? And simply, communication is the way that you deliver words, messages in the form of things like flyers, websites, person-to-person interaction, things like that. You can advance. And then messaging. What is messaging? It's the way in which you say it. It's the words and phrases or talking points, or as many of you have been communicating to us in the chat box, the way in which you speak to parents about their children or about early learning or early childhood. So that's simply what messaging is. And then you might hear the phrase, and it's a little jargony, and again, that is something that has come up in the chat box. What's jargon? Strategic communication. So strategic communication, the easy way to say that is it's the difference between walking or walking with a destination. So anyone can walk around and talk gibberish or just talk, but if they're not focused on the end game, ultimately, what you want to get out of that communication, that it is not strategic. But we always use an analogy at our firm around whatever your goal is, that is your destination. And with strategic communication, you want to know where you're going, because all the steps that lead up to that conversation, like talking with a parent about their child, must be purposeful and strategic. Go ahead, Lauren. So strategic communication and messaging. So the combination, again, many of you have been already doing that in the chat box. You have a particular goal in mind with what you want to get out of this conversation. And your strategic communication has been, my goal is, my destination is, I want to know what jargon is, how to best speak with parents so they understand what's going on with their child. And the messaging side of that, you already know what you need to say. You just need to make sure it's the right words and phrases, so they can understand literally the words that are coming out of your mouth in a way that speaks to them, that meets them where they are. So you are already engaging in strategic communication and messaging. So again, Lauren, you can go to the next slide, but this is really about the messaging that you're using is about being consistent. And teachers, pediatricians, those who engage children and parents every day are usually the most consistent when it comes to strategic communication and messaging, making sure that what you say is aligned with those that you're engaging in a way that they can understand. So one thing that has come up as we've asked you all what your desire is around better understanding messaging. And this comes up not only in Louisiana, but in all the states that we've worked in across the country, is the importance of aligning that messaging or the words and phrases that you use with the particular audience that you're engaging. So for many of you already, it's been my audience, and that's a formal way of saying those to whom I'm speaking are parents. I need to make sure that the words and phrases that I'm using meet them where they are, that they understand. As opposed to if you were to stand in front of a group of business leaders, or perhaps teachers who work exclusively with children with special needs, or a broader group of just a general audience at, say, a public library that wants to know a little more about early learning. You might have to modify some of the words or the messaging that you might use to make sure that what you're saying meets them where they are. So for example, in many polls that we've done across the country, when talking to business or more conservative audiences about the broader field of early learning, what has appealed to them is that effectively the money that you put in to early learning systems has a return on that investment in a ton of other ways, as opposed to early learning audiences like this one today, teachers, early learning professionals, mental health workers. The social emotional development is critical. So high quality early learning allows young children to understand and manage their emotions, get along with others, show empathy, and build positive relationships. Again, both of those, and then the third one, still speak to early learning, but are modified in a way for that audience. The one thing for all audiences that we've proved through quantitative research that we've done across the country is that regardless of audience, regardless of state or region, political affiliation, male, female, all the things, that when you, for the most part, when you talk about brain science or the way in which children develop in the early years, people understand that, or people are persuaded by the fact that the first 5 years, the brain development that goes on in the first 5 years of a child's life builds the foundation for their future, not only from an academic perspective, but socially, workforce, behavior-wise. So those are just 3 examples of what we've seen across the country when it comes to different audiences or different groups of people and words and phrases and messaging that appeals to them. Go ahead, Lauren. So I'm just going to stop there for a moment, just to remind everyone, and I say this on most of our webinars, that the chat box is your friend, but I am already seeing that this group is already knows that quite well. So Lauren, you can keep moving.
Not seeing any questions.
Okay, great. So let's dive into some messaging do's and don'ts. This is a chart that it has a lot. There's a lot of content there. But I think what we've realized over the years is these are the things that, although logical, we all know that we need to stay positive and use visuals and meet people where they are. And when we can, use data and be concise in what we say. But in the moment of everyday life, when we're in the weeds of working, it's easy to forget that these are some of the things that we have to remind ourselves when we're talking to certain, well, all audiences, but in particular, certain audiences like parents, to be concise, to not use jargon, which I'll get into in a second. Lauren, I hate to do this to you, but can you advance to the word cloud about jargon? I just want to make sure that we're responding to what people are asking for.
Do you mean the items they put in the box?
Oh, no, developmentally appropriate practice, things like that. It's okay. It's okay. So what I'm already hearing from people is the desire to better understand the use of jargon or its lack of, and then to be concise in that communication. We are in a field that loves phrases and things like developmentally appropriate practice, or even social emotional development. That might be really tough for certain parents to understand. So instead of saying developmentally appropriate practice, it might be easier to say the way your child learns and grows and thinks and behave, we want to be responsive with certain tools that we use in this school to make sure we align with your child's needs. Lauren, you can advance. So we're gonna, as a result of what you have said, and frankly, that aligns with what we deal with a lot around the country in many different states and regions, is really focusing up on being concise and jargon free, which is part of why we named this Give Jargon the Boot. So Lauren, do you want to take this as far as a poll?
Yep, so I just went ahead and launched the poll. It should say, which of the following messaging do's is most challenging for you? I'll give folks a few seconds to respond. All right, give it another few seconds. Okay, let's see our results. So it looks like most people say they struggle with being concise, followed really closely by being jargon free and using data, and lastly, staying positive. Yeah. All right, back to you, Scarlett.
All right, great. Thanks, Lauren. So that definitely aligns with what we've been talking about so far, but keep those comments coming. And in fact, I want to just stop for a moment to ask our chat box monitors if something needs to be addressed or if I need to answer a question. So Lori or Nikki, anything that we need to lift up?
Thanks, Scarlett. I think that I think really that the piece seems to be the question, and really making sure that we addressing that we're not the target audience, that what we have to meet parents where they are, or others where they are, not where we are. And that's the jargon and conciseness.
Absolutely. Thanks, Lori. Lauren, you can advance. So again, these are just some checklists for those who have said, look, I'm having a tough time either speaking with parents or with others about children and their development. These next few slides can offer just a really general guide to making sure that you're checking the boxes before you're having those conversations. And really at the end of the day, per some of the questions that are coming in, is that keeping free, understanding what as a parent that parent needs to hear, and how they need to hear it. And it could come down to just asking, what would be helpful for you to know or understand for this conversation? And Lauren, you can advance. And that will allow you to mold and shape your messaging and the words and phrases that you use so they can understand some of the things that are going on with their child. And that really goes back to avoiding the jargon that we use. I always go back to developmentally appropriate practice. Even the words like curriculum, mandates, thresholds, things like that are tough for some parents to understand. I know as a parent myself who works in the early learning field, it was definitely a curve I had to proactively bend to understand some of the things that even some of the preschool teachers were telling me, and then some of the primary school teachers were telling me. In addition, if you have to use data information, making sure you circle back with the parent to say, does that make sense? Is there a way I can clarify? These things are tough to understand. These things sometimes aren't made for people like us who are working, raising children, perhaps even taking care of parents or grandparents or other family members. We need to know this snippet so we can keep it moving. So yes, it gets, meeting people where they are, and making sure you as the messenger is respecting and understanding that parent's ability or inability to really understand. Examples, you can advance, Lauren. Examples are really good. So this is a great picture. It's hard to do the right thing when there is syrup involved. And it's really about learning to tell people what they need to hear, but versus what they want to hear. And as teachers who engage parents, and you might have to deliver tough to hear messages, that's a difficult moment to be in. And that's why we all at our firm ask people to start off conversations like that by saying, what do you need from me out of this conversation? What does success look like to you? What is the goal of this conversation? When you leave this meeting today, what do you want to think in your mind as you leave to say, you know what, that was helpful. That was a useful part of my day. I now better understand what's going on with my child and working back from there. I'm not saying it's easy, but staying positive, being short and concise, and offering up solutions for parents or any other target audience is going to help to have a productive and potentially jargon-free engagement. Lauren, you can advance. So we have a training that we do called Give Jargon the Boot. And jargon, to define it, is words and phrases that people in the general public wouldn't necessarily know what you're talking about. And we're going to provide some very specific examples in just a bit from the early learning space and the K-12 space to really give you an idea of what we're talking about. But over the years, our firm has really tried to deconstruct or pull apart things that sound very fancy and overwhelming, but really mean simple things. And we've distilled that down to 4 questions. So when you're overwhelmed with content, and we do this with a lot of different audiences through trainings, when you're overwhelmed with content, just basically about trying to explain to other people what you do in early learning or K-12 education or in the early learning space, is answering these 4 questions. What do you do? How do you do it? Why it matters for your region or community? And why specifically should they care about that work? I think in the early learning space, we tend to lean back on research and a lot of jargon-filled content, and it ends up confusing people. When if you're able to, and you can advance, if you're able to just simply and succinctly speak from the heart, and we'll get to that in a second too, it's much better for people to understand. So in full disclosure, Lauren is about to play a video of an interview between a reporter, someone from the City Club of Cleveland, and the superintendent of Cleveland Public Schools. Full disclosure, Eric Gordon is one of our clients. And Eric does such a wonderful job of not using jargon, of being concise, of being empathetic, and effectively answering what could be a very long, drawn out answer to a fairly tough question. So Lauren, I'll let you play that for everybody.
All right. Hold on.
Sure.
Make sure I got full audio here.
To help the district in ways that are not financial. I've heard many who are.
Hold on.
I knew that that was not just scholarships, but support services. Now the whole world feels that it's our world. Even the support services matter more. Our family support specialists are not only supporting their 15 schools, they have other schools that are working full time. We are also ramping up the next wave of schools, another 26 in the coming school year, despite being in a remote. If we needed any evidence that it was the right step for the team in place, we have it. I also just have to shout out our nurses because they have done, again, an incredible job, including our nurses when we did our closure, collected all of our personal protective equipment, so unused and got it to the county health board so that it was redistributed to our hospital and healthcare system. And also can do is design not financial. I've heard many who are interested in providing support but cannot do so financially. How can we help? And I would invite you to start with say yes and the mentoring that is needed there. Yeah, so one thing that anybody with a degree can do is to sign up for the ACS mentoring program. You do that through College and Operator Cleveland. We actually are bucking the trend nationally. So nationally, we're seeing a large.
Are folks not able to hear?
It's tough to hear, Lauren, and we're getting a couple of things. It's a little muffled.
Okay.
Is that the loudest we can go?
Yeah.
Okay.
I was trying to see if I could get the sound to work a little bit better on here. I apologize, folks.
Sure. So what we can do, Lauren, what I'm thinking is that we send that link out so everyone, and we have the marker where Eric answers this question. Yep. Just for context, this was an interview, a very long interview that Eric did with local media around the challenges within this school district operating within the context of COVID-19. So very stressful. And Eric pivoted back to the fact that his kids are the priority. We need to make sure they have what they need. We're working as hard as we can, as quickly as we can, to do the right things across public health requirements, academic needs, social emotional learning or social emotional needs, and protection of the family unit during this very, very tough time. He does that in a way that was very articulate. So we'll make sure we share that link with you after the webinar.
Yep, and I just put it in the chat box as well, just so folks have it.
Thank you. Thank you, Lauren. I'm sorry about that, everybody. And then, Lori has just shared with me, thank you, Lori, for the reminder around the jargon. I keep on saying developmentally appropriate practice, competencies, accreditation, quality improvement systems, career pathways, articulation, even things like fine motor skills, gross motor skills. I had to think about that as a parent, which is which. So thank you, Lori, for sharing that. But those are very much the types of words and phrases that as you're communicating to parents or others about early learning work that we need to break down. And we'll do it in a second with a couple of examples. Okay, so just a quick example or a quick breakdown of this 4-prong or 4-question Give Jargon the Boot tool. And just, I'm asking you for a second to think about what you do, your work. So think about your work, the work that you do every day. And if someone asked, well, Lauren, what do you do? What do you do? How do you do it? Why is it important? Why should anyone care? So the what do you do is stating in 10 words or fewer, the answer to that question. What do you do? Go ahead, Lauren. How do you do it? Literally, what do you do every day? So if you are a teacher of or a staff person working with kids, literally, what do you do? Again, keeping it to 10 words or fewer and leaving out the jargon. Go ahead, Lauren. And then why does it matter? Think of when you're talking to a parent or a legislator or a teacher that maybe teaches something completely different from what you are doing every day, and write down all the ways that your work impacts the people that you work with every day, namely the children and the kids. Children and the parents. And then the fourth question is around why anyone should care. I think this was originally 3 questions, and then when we've done a ton of lobbying work and advocacy work, many legislators, community leaders, and sometimes parents wanted to know, well, why should I care about what's going on over there, or with those kids, or with that community? And we added this last question, and again, still thinking about the work that you do, why should anyone care? In short, anyone in the early learning arena, K-12 arena, because the work that you do every day solves a ton of challenges that communities have, that society has, that neighborhoods have, that schools have. So really outlining some of the things that the work that you do overcomes or solves or helps to resolve. Go ahead, Lauren. So at the end of the day, this is something that, this is actually a training that we spend many times all day on with groups to really hammer away at purging the jargon from the work and the words that we do and say. So Lauren, you can advance. So this is one example. I think a lot of people in Louisiana understand the PDG grants. These were federal grants that were given to states over the last few years. And we pulled this from the federal application. So I just want everyone to take a look at that for a second and soak it in. And in response to the questions that we've been getting around what is jargon, this, you can't see me because I'm circling it on my own computer, that is jargony. It's filled with jargon. So if we start to break that down in a way that allows for people to better understand what that means, Lauren, you can advance. So if someone said, what does the PDG grant do? And instead of using what was on the previous slide, the answer to that is it will help our state better partner and coordinate all the things that we're doing for young children so they can learn, grow, and thrive in school and in life. So Lauren, can you bump back to the previous slide? So this slide is supposed to say what the PDG grant does. And then Lauren, can you bounce back? And so those 4 sentences really strip out all the jargon. It'll help our state better coordinate and do the work that we need to do on behalf of young kids. Okay, Lauren, you can move ahead. So how do you do it? How does the PDG grant do what it does? And the answer to that is all children are offered and supported with programs, services that are safe and nurturing, led by teachers who know what they're doing, and helping those kids learn, grow, and thrive. So again, thinking about that previous slide of all that jargon, and then why does it matter? Well, when states use PDG to work in partnership with parents and organizations, to make sure all those services and what we do for kids, we're working together, then children are better prepared. And then the big one, why should anyone care? And I'll further de-jargon this, is that when kids are successful in the early years, everyone benefits. So as we have said, and as Lori is reminding me in the chat box, if your grandmother or that uncle who doesn't know what you do, doesn't understand what you're saying, then it's too much jargon. Then you have to go back and figure out an easier way for people to understand the communication. Go ahead, Lauren. So this was a conversation I actually was having with my 5-year-old last night as I was going through these slides. And I asked him, you know, what if you are trying something, and even if you've worked on it before, and you just can't get it right? And what we've heard from many people over the years when it comes to being concise and jargon free and having a tough time talking with parents or whomever is, I don't know if I'm getting all my information across, you know, and I don't know if I'm saying it the right way, word for word. And if I don't use certain phrases and words, I'm going to get in trouble. Go ahead, Lauren, you can. And at the end of the day, as my 5-year-old said, after I posed the question to him, what if you're trying and you just don't get it right? He goes, it's okay. It's okay, you try again. So that's what we want to reinforce to you all, that this is a muscle that's built over time. And if you don't get the words and phrases right, or if you don't feel like you got as much out of a conversation with a parent as possible, it's okay. It improves over time. The muscle is built over time. So I'm just going to stop there. And Lori, what do we have coming from the chat box? What themes?
Everyone hear me?
Yep.
Great. I think folks are, people are absolutely resonating with the definition, right? So original phrase, the original set of sentences from the grant, and how you just said it out loud. People are absolutely getting that, which is great. I think 4 steps and breaking it down are the things that people are really going to be honing in on. And I saw a question about whether or not people can get this as an example in the PowerPoint, and it is available, I think, in the app as well as in the teacher leader library. So hopefully you weren't trying to write it down super quickly. It is there for you as an example. And what we always say, or what I always do, is say it out loud. Say it to yourself in a mirror. Say it to your spouse. Say it to your kid. If they don't get it, then you probably need to go back to the drawing board. You do have a question about, you know, some parents will admit that they don't understand because they don't want to come across ignorant. They're self-conscious about their own education and understanding, and it's hard for them to engage. So I don't know, Scarlett, you want to talk about, that's one question, then we have a second one.
Sure. We always remind people that whether it's a parent or many times it's legislators and community leaders who you think, well, they'll be comfortable, they'll know, or they won't be insecure about what they know, what they don't know or understand, especially when it comes to IEPs for special need kids or IEPs for any child, is starting off that conversation by saying, please interrupt me if this doesn't make sense. Or breaking it down to say, so this IEP says this, but let me tell you what that means when you're at home. Let me tell you what that means when I am with your son or daughter in the classroom. This is the step that I use to get to the goal that's very jargony in this IEP. I'll say this as a parent, my older son, who is now 9, when he was about 2.5, his fine motor skills, or maybe a little older than that, 3.5, were not where they should be. And they were afraid he wasn't going to be able to begin to draw the letters of the alphabet. And so they told me, well, they would recommend more fine motor skill activity. And I said, I don't know what that is. But then they said, well, we'll show you what we do. He played with Legos and Play-Doh and things like that, finger painting. And that opened up my mind to, oh, that's what fine motor skills are. That's how you get to this goal when it comes to this child. Lori, what was the second answer or question?
Actually, you started to address it. The special needs families, child that is special in particular, get a lot of jargon thrown at them. So what's the best thing to do? And I would encourage you, when you get the slide deck, to go back to the message creation checklist and look at all the different ways that you can break down. You're saying one of those things is telling a story. That storytelling, so giving the example, bringing it to life, that concrete example. So you already kind of went down that path. People are asking if we don't include the jargon in the IEP, or is it okay to offset it when explaining to the parents? So written jargon versus spoken jargon.
I love that. And the last thing I'll say is I love that, the glazed look. We get a lot of glazed looks when we talk to legislators about poverty. And one of my favorite examples when talking to a legislator who is fairly new about mobility rates and the fact that many children who start in ABC elementary school in September will go, because of family mobility, will end up going to 2 or 3 elementary schools between September and June. And she sat back and she looked at me with that glazed look and said, well, why would someone want to move that often? Did they just not like their apartment? And so I had to step back and meet her where she was, which was in a place where she didn't understand poverty. That's a big chunk to bite off in a 10-minute conversation with a legislator that you just met. So I used a couple of strategies, but I said, well, I'll give you an example of this school and of this child that their parents lost their jobs. Their new job had to bring them across town, so they had to move. So that was the reason for the first move. So that's what we talk about when we talk about mobility, it's directly tied to poverty. So I know that's a slightly different example, but it just is a real world example of having to take a step back. And it reminded me that I can't assume that people know some of those terms. Okay. Next slide. I think we're up for a break. Ms. Sogor, if I'm correct?
Yes, we're going to take a quick 2-minute break. So I'm going to just start a timer and we will come back at, looks like it'll be about 9:53 on my clock. So everyone just take a breather. I'm going to see if I can figure out our sound thing while we're on a break. Okay. Hopefully everybody feels a little more refreshed. I'm going to try to see if I can get our video to work again, so bear with me.
Protein gluten-free pate.
It's a burrito.
I'm going to start with some Balearic.
Let me come back to the screen here. Can folks hear me? Can somebody just type in the chat box if you were able? Yes, you can hear. Perfect. All right. So let me toggle back. Bear with me 1 second. Perfect. All right.
Clip-ins, then razor cut up to a blunt angled lob. I'm dead. I'm back. It's going to be everything.
What?
He's gonna make your hair long, then cut it short to make it big.
Oh, okay.
What's the strongman?
It's a pea protein gluten-free pate.
It's a burrito filled with plants pretending to be meat.
Last night took an L, but you're not a bounce back.
What's an L?
The rap singer took a loss, and now he's okay.
Right.
Every week I bounce back.
Living large.
Living with his mama.
Likes long walks.
Doesn't have a car.
Entrepreneur.
Unemployed.
Oh! Yeah, you can get a mortgage that avoids PMI, but there's no way to avoid MIP on an FHA. Now,
This'll help.
Rocket Mortgage by Quicken Loans makes the complex simple.
Right.
Understand the details and get approved in as few.
All right, Scarlett, I'm going to bring back up the slide, but we had to make sure we shared that little Jargon translator video. That's a fun one.
Yeah, it's one of the best out there. So if people are, again, we can share the link in the chat box. That is one of the best examples of real life jargon and the glazed over looks that you get when people just don't break it down. So another example of giving jargon the boot that is happening in real time. So the CARES Act is part of the act that they're using to respond to COVID-19 needs in states, localities. So the federal government, it's their bill, unemployment, things like that. Part of the CARES Act has funds in it for students. And I'm not going to go into too much detail on that because it'll give away the de-jargon version. But this is a real example. I just want to make sure everyone's muted. This is a real example that ACS ran into when we had to break down the purpose of a certain section of the CARES Act. So everyone could just take a quick look at this slide. It's nice and jargony. Sections of law, jargony phrases like explicit decision that these funds are redistributed to Title I eligible, a formula based on residency regardless of need, et cetera, et cetera. So the translation of that, as if we're in that commercial, just not as fun and exciting. Lauren, if you can bump to the next slide, is the CARES Act requires public dollars to go to children living in poverty, and any other use would not align with the purpose of that act. Really simple. We actually had to tussle with the attorney to use that version when talking to public officials. So you can understand why de-jargoning is so critical. So that's an extreme example, but maybe not so extreme. Okay. So Lauren, I want to make sure that we have time for me to go through this. I'll go through it really quickly.
I think you're good. You're good, Scarlett. I'm going to drop the second video later. So you're the third video. So you're good.
So the next slide really was about telling a story. And this definitely applies to almost any audience with whom you speak. It just depends on what kind of story you tell, but allows people to relax a little bit. I know many people who work with students with special needs are themselves parents or relatives of children with special needs. And that perspective is frankly more important than some of the words that are coming out of your mouth about an IEP or maybe your experience as a teacher or a staff person. So making sure you share that if you're comfortable with the parents or caregivers that you're talking to. I use a story. I mean, a lot of people will say, well, what if I'm not? What if I don't have that perspective? Everyone has a story. I am not the type of person who's going to share a ton of my personal world in my work world, but I really had to be thoughtful when trying to get the point across about how powerful storytelling can be. And while some of them might not be the most dramatic, because we all see TED Talks and things like that, where people have some really outstanding stories that are very deep and very exciting and very intriguing. It doesn't have to go that far. It can be something very simple and straightforward. So I tell this story about a little boy named Anthony, and I knew Anthony as an adult. And I was talking to him one day as an adult, he's now almost in his 80s, about the field of early learning and how critical the impact is of early learning on the future child in work, social emotional development, academics, everything. And this is a picture of him at around 4th grade. And he was telling me that back when he was in school and very young, the 0 to 5, 0 to 10 years, he started school in 1st grade. And he said this picture was of him in 4th grade, where he was retained. He was left back in 4th grade. And he also told me when he started school in 1st grade, they held him back in 1st grade as well. And I asked him why, and he reminded me that he had 2 parents who were immigrants and did not speak English. So when he had a tough time in school, he did not have that support at home. And he grew up in a time where that wasn't a thing. Social emotional development, extra assistance wasn't a thing. And Lauren, you can go to the next slide. And this is him as a high school senior. And I said, well, you graduated, you're a good looking guy, you're a senior, you've had a great productive career in law enforcement. He spent 30 years as a police officer. And he said, well, I was always surprised I made it to that picture, because after being retained for those 2 years, not having support, his parents did divorce. He was told, because of that trajectory, every teacher along the way said, you will never graduate from high school. So instead of going and looking at the police force or the fire department, because you'll never work in a white collar job, you should just go to a technical school. And he explicitly had teachers tell him that he would never graduate from high school. And he scraped his way through and said, I always wonder what my trajectory would have been with that early learning experience. And Lauren, you can go to the next slide. So not only is this a personal story, a story to help illuminate the power of storytelling, but it is personal because those are Anthony's grandchildren. Those are my kids, and Anthony is my dad. So it was a very illuminating conversation I had with my dad, and that was probably only 5 years ago, when he told me that entire story that I never knew after being on this earth for, at the time, over 40 years. So everyone, at the end of the day, everyone has a story, and trying to share those components with your target audiences, that story would probably not work for a business community, but I bet you it would work for a room full of law enforcement officers, or teachers or other early learning professionals. But it's just an example that I like to use of what is possible if you dig into what you've done throughout your life and apply it to that strategic communication or those strategic communication efforts. So I'm just going to stop there. Lori, is there anything in the chat box that you'd like us to address?
I think the one thing that I'm seeing consistently is around other people needing to understand that that getting rid of jargon is important. Admins, teachers, this is something that goes up and down the ladder and across. So I think it's less of a question. I think it's more of a comment. And I believe Megan in particular mentioned as a newer teacher, she had lots of questions. So what we often think about is perhaps you need to always remember, like when you were new, what didn't you know? So putting yourself in the audience's shoes.
Thanks, Lori. That's great. And thanks, Megan. That's a great example. Great example. When I think back, I'm like, I always say to people, I don't understand. Talk to me like I'm a fourth grader, because that's how old my oldest son is now. Because if he can understand it, I can probably understand it, especially if it's related to math. So yes, putting yourself in the shoes of your target audience. Go ahead, Lauren. So just as Lori has mentioned, as Lauren has mentioned, everything that is in this webinar is available for free on our website in the tools section. Many of them are fillable PDFs, others are not, but they're all there if you want to access them at any point in time. And also, the last thing I'll say before I bump it over to Lauren is this is not easy stuff. And I'll bring you back to what my 5-year-old said last night. It's okay. It's okay. Just try again. This is something that we as a firm have worked on for a decade and a half and really longer before we started the firm. So just have patience with yourself. And if people know that you're coming from the right place, you'll get to where you need to go from a strategic communication and messaging perspective. With that, I'll pass the baton over to Lauren.
Thanks, Scarlett. And I just want to lift up a comment that Layla just made in the chat box. She said, I just learned something. Jargon is not just our words, but also expecting someone to be able to relate to our experiences. Cultural differences, social status, and economic differences are important. Diversity is a factor. Well said, Layla. Thank you. That is exactly right. And this is, I think, actually a really great segue, and please continue to type your questions into the box. We're going to have a dedicated section of the end of the session for questions, so definitely feel free to put them in there. We just want to spend a few minutes talking about effective presentations, which I think is a nice segue from the messaging we've been discussing, because a lot of us in our jobs at some point are asked to present on something we've done, something we've learned, a project, and it really does follow the same, doing that well does follow the same kinds of principles that Scarlett has been talking about in terms of the jargon. So I just want to spend a few minutes talking a little bit about making your presentations even more effective. And the first one is this concept of knowing your audience, which again is what we've been talking about a lot this morning, but it's even just a little bit beyond that. It's doing a little bit of homework before you go in to understand how many people are you going to be speaking with, who are they, and what are their expectations, right? So I think to the point that that Scarlett was making, you're going to be approaching an audience of parents very differently than you might approach an audience of policymakers. They're going to come in with different understanding. They're going to have different sets of jargon that they're familiar with. And honestly, they're going to care about different things, right? So being really clear and understanding that before you start is the first step. The other thing I don't want to go through all the questions on this slide, but I just want to underscore that, you really do want to elicit emotion from people. And that is where the storytelling comes in, right? They're going to remember how you made them feel. And we have this quote up here from Maya Angelou too. So you need to go in understanding already kind of emotionally where they're coming from. So, and we've talked about this with the parents, right? If you have a parent, a group of parents even, and you're going to be presenting to them and you know they might have quite a bit of anxiety around the future of their child and their child's educational approach, that's important to know. And you can adapt your presentation to maybe have a little bit less information, go a little bit slower, all the things that you would want if you were feeling anxious and when someone was trying to teach you something new. And you know, likewise, if people are maybe more likely to disagree with what you're about to share, it's just something to keep in mind as you're approaching the situation. And I think also very importantly is what you want people to do. So we always want to have some sort of call to action in our presentations. It could be something as simple as, you know, follow up with me after so we can have a personal conversation, or it could be call your legislator, right? There's lots of different types of actions, but be sure up front that you've planned out what that call to action is. Let me just make sure folks are muted. Let me keep going. If you are not muted, please be sure. Okay, I think we're good. I hear it. It went away. And the other thing is to think about the approach. So one recommendation that we have whenever you are charged with some sort of presentation is to take some time to actually map it out. Just take a notebook and jot down what are the 3 things you want your audience to remember. You're really only going to be able to get across a little bit of content, right, in the short amount of time that you have. So then figure out how you're going to support and illustrate those 3 points, put everything else aside. To the point that Scarlett made earlier about what people need to know versus want to know, right? A common mistake that we have because we're so passionate and excited about what we're talking about is that we want to share everything under the sun, and other people can't actually can't retain all of that content. So particularly if you've only got a short amount of time to get across something really important with a specific audience, you got to be choosy. And then you want to repeat those things, right? So we only retain a little bit, and we only retain it if it's repeated for us. So think about how in the course of your presentation, you can repeat those key messages. Another common challenge that a lot of us face, particularly if we work within a large system, is that we're given a template, right? Here's a presentation template, and I need you to use this. And that is great because they've done some of the work for us, but it also can be challenging. And we really want you to encourage you to think about those templates as an off-the-rack pair of pants, right? So some of us are blessed with matching off-the-rack sizes, but most of us are not. And this is your opportunity to tailor that presentation to really meet the needs of your audience. A number one way to do that is to incorporate stories, as Scarlett was demonstrating. You can do this without adding slides. You can just do this in your talking points and in your notes. But telling, for example, a story about a specific child, obviously without naming names, but an anecdote about a child and their experience in your classroom and why that was meaningful and important is going to go a long way to convincing people or persuading them to change their behavior. Likewise with data, we don't mean throw 45 statistics up there, but we do mean find a couple of bullet points that really drive home what this content means for that audience, whether it's within the school district or within your community or even within your state. The other piece is interaction. So especially with sort of off-the-rack decks or off-the-rack pants, in this case, we encourage you to think about how you can engage that audience throughout the process. Even if you don't change anything else about the slides or the presentation you've been given, can you incorporate polls? Can you do some Q&A? If you're live in person, what are some ways you can get people to stand up, move around, do breakout sessions, and really get them to also engage in directing the flow of the conversation so that you can spend more time on the points that are most interesting and relevant for them. The other thing is you might be able to add or remove content in order to meet the needs of your audience. And on this slide, you'll just see some quick tips and tricks, again, for ways to kind of make your presentation more engaging, more inviting, using quotes, again, engaging your audience. I think finding happiness is a big one, right? We are really passionate about our work. I'm confident that everyone on this webinar is, or you frankly wouldn't be here, right? You want to improve, you want to learn, you want to do your very best, whether you're in the classroom or out in the community. And conveying that happiness and that passion for your work is really important, even if you're nervous giving a presentation. So we encourage you to think about how to do that. Deploying analogy and metaphor is another great one. The pants, the pants metaphor is always a fun one, but there's lots of those throughout. Putting statistics in context, we've already talked about this a few times, but again, a stat alone is probably not as impactful as a stat partnered with a story and a little bit of context of why that matters, and why that is going up or down, or where that is going to be heading as a trend over time. Of course, getting comfortable, anyone who's ever, heard a presentation or gotten a training on public speaking knows you really have to get comfortable with the information behind the presentation and being comfortable with the stats and with the key messages. Using a jargon, again, this is a good one for if you're thinking about going into an environment with an audience that might be quite different than you, is how can you match your content into their jargon. So if you're going into a medical establishment, you might want to do a little bit of research to think about what are the words that are going to resonate with healthcare providers that maybe don't make sense to educators, so that they understand that you get them and they're more likely to really follow what you're saying. And we've really, I think, covered, kind of personalizing and telling stories. I'll just say another important way is emphasizing values. So similar to the idea of jargon, it might be very important for you to do a little bit of background research on on the audience you're going to in terms of what they care about. So we know, for example, if you're going to be speaking to the Chamber of Commerce, business principles are key. So you're going to want to emphasize the business case for investing in early childhood or K through 12. Hey, these are your future employees. This is a fiscally wise choice to make. Right, you're emphasizing the values that audience is going to care about, because frankly, morals might not always be enough, right? We need to meet people where they are. So those are just a couple of quick things. I don't want to spend too much time. I'm actually going to skip the video on this section because we want to make sure we have time to engage in some Q&A with you all, and we'll put this in the chat in a moment. And I also want to point you to another tool. As we mentioned, there are all free resources on our website, advocacyandcommunication.org. So if you go to our website and go to the tools and resources section, we have a piece called Overcoming Bad Habits, and it's specifically about how to be a better public speaker and presenter. You can see just a screenshot of a couple of pieces on here, things like avoiding reading your presentation, making sure you're making eye contact, avoiding fidgeting. I'm a terrible fidgeter, so that's always something I'm working on. But you can see, Zoom in a lot of ways helps us avoid some of these, but in other ways, it's even more challenging because you're readjusting to totally new platform. So we just encourage you to take a look at this resource, test some of these out. I always love the tip we have up here on videotaping yourself. That is terrifying, and I highly recommend it. It is a very good way to recognize your own strengths as a speaker and also your opportunities for improvement. So I'm going to pause there because we definitely want to have a good chunk of time. We've got 15 more minutes. We'd like to spend at least the next 10 answering some of your questions that you're putting in the chat box. So I'm going to go ahead and stop talking and see if Lori or Nikki or Scarlett, if anything's come in before I've had a chance to read up on it that you want to make sure we talk about.
Thanks, Lauren. So the first question is about the message creation checklist. And Nikki did share in the chat box that it's available on our website, but it's also, the checklist it was a few slides earlier as well. It helps you think about, if you do this on the left-hand side, think about this on the right-hand side. So, and Lauren is going to go back to that slide so you can see it. There are way more details behind that message creation checklist. So these are just a few examples of what that looks like, but it really helps you think about, I now am creating this, whether it's written or not. And you can hear from our comments over and over again that you need to think about, what is your data, meet people where they are, use a story, use the right messengers, these are all the things that we've repeated to you so that it gets into your brain, which we know it takes 7 to 10 times of you hearing something before you're able to really take it in and soak it in and be able to reflect it back out. So this checklist is all about you trying to make sure that you think about this and how do you resolve it. So that's the message creation checklist. Scarlett, the next question for you is, who would be a good messenger to use to communicate with families?
So certainly depends on the context. So in keeping with the theme of many of the questions, if it is a teacher communicating to parents or caregivers or families of a child, I think what we try to, when we sit down and think about the appropriate messenger, we want to think of who does that parent, caregiver, or family trust. Many times when it comes to the education of young children, or even children in the primary grades, many times it is a pediatrician or a health professional, a teacher who's worked with that child. Sometimes it's a minister or a pastor of their church. Sometimes it's a neighbor or another family member that either that family or that child responds to. So it's really sitting back and thinking, okay, who would be able to wrap their arms around this family or this child with ease and comfort, and thinking about that list. And so I want to be more specific, but it depends on the individual family. But I think what we've seen from the research and from our experience on the ground is that most of the time, most families are comfortable with other family members, other families that have gone through the same thing, teachers, kindergarten teachers, and healthcare professionals that they've built relationships with prior to you coming onto the scene. Lori or Lauren, do you have any additions to that?
I think that's right on. Depends on what the purpose is, and it depends on what the family needs.
Yep.
There's no right or wrong answer there for sure. The next question is around, I'm going to characterize it as framing, because there was a question around, you can definitely relate this to getting a school district millage passed to a population that is either not supportive of whether it's taxes or public schools versus private schools in the area. So I'm going to characterize it as framing. And Scarlett, I know we're not going to get into a whole framing discussion right now, but I think that, to me, that's what this is getting at, if you want to talk about that.
Yeah, at the end of the day, when it comes to the specific conversation around school levies, and Lori and I have worked inside of a school district. We now work with over a dozen school districts around the country. People want to know what's in it for them and what they get out of it. And although that doesn't necessarily align with some of our personal values, we have to make sure that we frame it or communicate it in a way that meets that person where they are. And some people want to know that I'm going to know in a year what my return on investment was in that levy, or I want to know that this person in the administration is there or not there. So making sure that you're answering the question, the takeaway is, what do they need to hear for them to understand why this is valuable to them? Because we are not the target audience. And that's really, really tough. I'd say I would have some jaw clenching conversations in that regard when it comes to things like school levies. Lori, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think you said it succinctly, concise, which is one of the things that we are all about. I'm going to turn the next question. I know Lauren's going to kick us off on answers, and I know I actually just came up with one of the responses. What are some bad habits to overcome, since most of our meetings will now be held online as opposed to face-to-face?
Would help if I unmuted myself. Yes, and I'm actually bringing up hopefully you can see this, everyone. I'm just bringing up the tool that we were just referencing about overcoming bad presentation habits, because I think this is a great question. And I also think that most of the kind of bad habits still apply, even when you were talking about being on Zoom, arguably maybe even more. So I think it's important to think about a couple ways to overcome these that you can do digitally. One of them, I know I was actually just struggling with this week, is this idea of reading your presentation, because the kind of physical structure of when you're on a Zoom call or a video call and your notes are printed and you're having to go up and down like this, right? So there's a couple tips that I've been thinking about. One is just if there's a giant binder clip and you can clip your script up to the screen, that actually really helps, because then you can in fact look at your presentation at the same time that you're looking at your screen, so that your camera has your eyes looking right up in front of you. So that's kind of like a virtual way to kind of cheat, like with a teleprompter. And I think the other ways, the not making eye contact is another tough one, because again, you don't actually have eyes to look at. So right now you can see, you want to look into your camera without being aggressive about it and weird. But I do think there's ways you can just practice sort of the same types of strategies that you would use in real life. And a lot of the other ones that you'll see on here, like speaking too long, speaking too quickly or too slowly, using too many uhs and ums, those are all the same challenges that you're going to face in real life. And so continuing to practice, this is also where the ums and the uhs tend to come when we're a little bit more nervous, or maybe we're rushing, or we're not as comfortable with the content. So you're trying to kind of think at the same time that you're speaking. And the advice I would have for that is always, it's okay to pause. You just heard me do an right? It's okay to pause, take a breath, keep talking. So it's very common, and it's just something we all have to continue to practice, whether we're doing it digitally or we're doing it in person. So again, it definitely encourage you to take a look at this tool. We've got a lot of different pieces in here. The other one, just in terms of the new world that we're in with the digital and virtual meetings, is that keeping kind of everything behind you pretty clean and neat, trying to get good lighting so that people can actually see your face, sort of lighting you from the front. Those are elements of presentation that you're going to have to adapt to in a virtual world that would have been handled for you by somebody else if you were in a normal office building. So I'll stop there. And Lori, what did you want to add?
Actually, I think Scarlett, you're going to add a couple things.
Yeah, I just saw someone say they had to do some lessons, communicate some lessons through videotaping, and it was an eye opener. And at the end of the day, it's all about practice and getting comfortable with being uncomfortable, looking at yourself at this point for many hours. I don't even want to look at myself for 90 minutes. So just making sure that you become comfortable and practice videotape. We do it in our trainings. You don't need fancy camera equipment. You need your iPhone, and just putting it up in front of you and making sure you understand certain tics and things that you may or may not do, and working on it over time, because regardless of what happens with COVID, this setup here, while it might dissipate over time, from our observation, is going to be a really strong thread in the new normal post-COVID.
Thanks, Scarlett. Another comment in the chat box was about the silence that scares you, and that sometimes you have to pause or you do a lot of ums because you're trying to organize your thoughts or your answers. And the good news is the brain processes things at a different rate than what you are actually going to say and what people are going to hear. So what you think is a long time actually isn't. We process things in a very different way when we're hearing something. So you might feel like it's a long time and I'm stopping. That's okay. And in fact, we encourage, as we help people develop their presentations and get rid of bad habits, taking a breath is a good idea. Taking that pause is actually a positive thing and you're being thoughtful. So don't feel like you're, like you have to just constantly talk. Silence is okay, because the silence that you're experiencing in your head is a much shorter time than the silence that they're experiencing from the listener, the audience. So I just wanted to say that. And I think that is, oh, and also good posture. And I think Lauren was alluding to that in terms of your bad presentation habits. Sitting up, particularly on a Zoom call, makes a big, or a Zoom presentation makes a huge difference. You are more engaged, you're able to project more, and you're really going to be able to deliver your message in a different way. And see, I just said, and that's okay. The world didn't fall apart because I just said, So I think it's also giving ourselves a break. I think we tend to be harder on ourselves than others would be on us. So we might think we're doing a poor job and everybody else is like, oh, that was great. So just keep, give yourself a break. Thanks, Lauren. Thanks, Scarlett.
I like this. This is a good suggestion from someone in the chat, Erica. She said, when my students ask me a question and I have to gather my thoughts, I actually tell them, let me think about it. I find it really engages them because they begin to think about it too. Think time is a very helpful thing for the presenter and the audience. Great point. Yep. So I know we are down to the last minute. So if folks have any final questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box. I do want to I want to encourage everyone a couple things. One is ACS has a wonderful book written by Lori and Scarlett, who have been sharing all of their wisdom this morning, called Influence on All Cylinders. And you can buy it online at Amazon. We have the link here on the screen. You can also get a link to it on our website. So encourage everyone to check that out. You get a lot more information on the very topics we've been discussing. And I also want to remind everyone to please complete the session evaluation through the Sketch app. We would love to hear your feedback on how this went. And we're just really, really grateful to have been able to be with you all this morning, sharing some of the things that we have learned over the years and hearing from you all. So I'm going to pause there. Any other questions, Lori or Scarlett, anything you wanted to add?
Thank you for letting us be a part of your morning.
Thank you so much. We'll just pause for a moment.